Good evening, and welcome to tonight's program on inclusive diplomacy, former Directors General's Perspectives. My name is Jim Dandridge, and I am the Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors for the Diplomacy Center Foundation. We're excited to bring this conversation to you this evening, which is a timely reflection of major national problems confronting America, the impact of institutional racism, and its resultant diminishment of our maximizing our potential in the formulation, articulation, and execution of foreign policy. I encourage you to take a note of the intentional wording of the title Inclusive and not Diversity Diplomacy. I'm sure that this nuance will not escape your thinking as our 5 panelists discuss their challenges as Directors General in a collective total of 16 years. For those who might not be familiar with the Diplomacy Center Foundation, we are the nonprofit partner of the U.S. Department of State in creating the National Museum of American Diplomacy. Right now, the museum is under development in Washington, D.C., but once it is fully open, it will be the nation's first museum dedicated to telling the story of American diplomacy and the world's first museum on the conduct of diplomacy. Now, I would like to take a moment to thank the generous support of our donors who make programs like this one possible. We know that times are tough, but if you enjoyed tonight's program and want to help us offer more programs like this in the future, you can donate to the Diplomacy Center Foundation by visiting our website at diplomacycenterfoundation.org/contribute. We also hope you will continue to stay up to date with the foundation and future programs by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Now, throughout tonight's program, you will join the conversation by using both the chat and the question and answer functions located on the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to ask questions to our panelists, and we will try to answer these during the program. Should we encounter any technical difficulties, please bear with us as we try to restore them. We would also like to keep in mind that tonight's conversation expresses the personal opinions of our panelists and do not represent the views of the Department of State, the US government, or any other organization. I'd like to introduce you to our moderator of our panel, Dr. Krenn, and the former Directors General. Dr. Michael Crin is a professor of history at Appalachian State University. He is the author of 6 books, including The Color of Empire, Race and American Foreign Relations in 2006. In alphabetical order, Ambassador Arnold Chacon, Director General of the Foreign Service, 2014 to 2017, and U.S. Ambassador to Guatemala, 2011 to 2014. Ambassador Ruth A. Davis, Director General of the Foreign Service, 2001 to 2003, Director of the Foreign Service Institute, 1997 to 2001, and U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Benin, 1992 to 1996. Ambassador Davis recently underwent extensive oral surgery, thus she will participate with a mask, and she insists on, to our benefit, sharing her experiences with this very experienced body of panelists. Ambassador Edward Gnehm, Director General of the Foreign Service, 1997 to 2000, and U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait, 1991 to 1994, Ambassador to Australia, 2000 to 2001, and Ambassador to Jordan, 2001 to 2004. Ambassador Mattie Sharpless, Director General of the Foreign Service, Foreign Agricultural Service, 2000 to 2001, Acting Administrator of the Foreign Service Agricultural Service, 2000 to 2001, and U.S. Ambassador to the Central African Republic, 2001 to 2003. And finally, Ambassador Harry Thomas, Director General of the Foreign Service, 2007 to 2009, Executive Secretary of the Department of State, 2005 to 2007, and U.S. Ambassador to Bangladesh, 2003 to 2005, Ambassador to the Philippines, 2010 to 2013, and Ambassador to Zimbabwe, 2016 to 2018. It is my pleasure now to give the program to our moderator, Dr. Michael Crin, who will initiate the conversation on inclusive diplomacy, former Directors General's perspectives. Dr. Krenn.
Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Jim, for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to serve as the moderator for this evening's program on a topic that has a long and troubling history. In 1949, a State Department official authored a memo entitled, "Countries to which an outstanding Negro might appropriately be sent as ambassador." After scouring the globe, that official could find only a small handful of appropriate countries, but this paled in comparison to his fruitless search for an outstanding Negro. After several pages, he came up with Ralph Bunche. The foreign policy bureaucracy of the United States, including the Department of State, the Foreign Service, and other agencies such as the Department of Agriculture, has struggled with the issues of diversity and inclusivity since at least the end of World War II. In the 75 years since that time, attempts at change have been sporadic and inconsistent, the results disappointingly meager, leaving many to wonder why nearly 8 years of promises, programs, and rhetoric have left that bureaucracy still woefully unrepresentative in terms of women and racial minorities. Indeed, during the last 20 years, we have seen a depressing procession of newspaper and magazine articles, editorials, blogs, and academic studies bemoan the lack of progress, point fingers at the culprits, and conclude with a sad shake of their collective heads that real solutions may never come to fruition. More recently, however, this issue has gained not only more urgency, but also wider and deeper attention. In January 2020, the GAO released its report on progress toward diversity in the Department of State and concluded that while the total number of minority and women employees increased by a few percentage points in the last 20 years or so, quote, the proportion of racial or ethnic minorities and women was lowest at the management and executive levels. Just a few months later, the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School argued that what was needed was, quote, a wholesale overhaul of the personnel system at State and the Foreign Service, involving a relentless focus on diversity as a first-order strategic priority. The following year, the Truman Center published its own study entitled Transforming State, that opened with the declaration, "It is no secret that the State Department, our nation's oldest cabinet-level agency, needs to transform to meet the needs of the 21st century. A central effort of that process should involve building a State Department that looks like America through better recruitment efforts, greater equity in assignments and promotions, and mentoring and retaining diverse talent." In response to these and other studies, the department recently announced the appointment of Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley as the first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer in the history of the Department of State. And thus, we are extremely fortunate to have with us tonight 5 professionals who have quite literally been on the front lines of this battle. 4 of the panelists served as Director Generals of the Foreign Service. Ambassador Sharpless held that same position with the Foreign Agricultural Service. Now, our format this evening will be a free-flowing discussion among our distinguished guests, during which they will provide us with their unique perspectives on the problems they faced, the solutions they attempted, their thoughts about the future of diversity and inclusivity in America's Foreign Service bureaucracy, as well as their answers to questions posed by our audience for tonight's program. And to start things off, I would like to ask each of our panelists the following question. Why is diversity and inclusion so important for the foreign relations of the United States? And what specific initiatives did you undertake as Director Generals to deal with this issue? And as befits a historian, I am going to address that to our panelists in the chronological order in which they served as Director Generals. And therefore, we will begin with Ambassador Sharpless.
Thank you, Dr. Crin. And I also would like to thank the Diplomats Center Foundation for having invited me to serve on the panel this evening here. Most people think of the Foreign Service, they think of the State Department, but I am from the Foreign Agriculture Service of the Department of Agriculture, and there are two foreign affairs agencies within the Department of Agriculture. In addition to FAS, as we are called, there's also the Animal and Health Plant Inspection Service, and we all went under the Foreign Service in the Foreign Service Act of 1980. And the Foreign Agriculture Service, as many of us know, is primarily the foreign agency that promotes U.S. agricultural exports, along with trade policy and market development and market analysis. And APHIS really works abroad to make sure that it keeps abreast of all types of diseases. And its goal is to protect U.S. agriculture, be it animal or be it plant health. So to the question that was just posed, why is diversity and inclusion important in carrying out foreign affairs by the United States? To me personally, those diversity and inclusion is very important, not only for carrying out foreign affairs, but for working within the United States itself. If we don't have diversity and inclusion at home, it's difficult to even have it abroad. So I think it's very, very important to have a representation of what the United States looks like, what our thought patterns are, what our backgrounds are, our educations are, all of these components which make up diversity within itself, including the various ethnic groups of this country. Now, when you specifically look at the various ethnic groups, a lot of emphasis is put on African Americans, but you also have the Hispanics, you have the Asians, you have many other representative groups, and in the various agencies of the US government, you would clearly see that come through. During my assignment in Paris as the agriculture minister counselor there are 42 agencies of the US government in that embassy. Although we have only 4 or 5 foreign affairs agencies, the US government is represented everywhere. So then to move on to the question of what I did, what initiatives I implemented when I was the Director General, I made a great effort, a really great effort of recruiting minorities, particularly those from the HBCU universities, because we were seeking agricultural economists and international trade policies, also recruiting women and recruiting any other minority group, training them, promoting them, making sure that they were assigned in posts that were commensurate with their ranks, and also making a great effort to retain them. But for me personally, the greatest initiative that I initiated was to initiate the fact that FAS Foreign Service officers were able to be nominated as candidates to serve as ambassadors. Our agency was established back in '53. We've traveled the world for many, many years, but this was the first time that we were able to be nominated. And so in 1997, at that particular time, Ambassador Ed Perkins was the Director General. He supported the initiative that I started. And in 1997, we had the first ambassador from the Foreign Agriculture Service confirmed. And I was the second one to be confirmed from our agency when I was confirmed in 2001. Since that time, we've had 5 ambassadors come out of USDA, and we are all very proud of that. And we all feel a part of the Foreign Service, and we all have to continue working to make the Foreign Service the same for all Foreign Service Affairs agencies. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Sharpless. And now we will turn it over to Ambassador Gnehm.
Thank you, Mike. I was Director General at a unique time. Maybe each of us will say that same thing, but for me, what that means is that I became Director General at the time 2 major lawsuits against the university were reaching sort of final resolution. One was a very important legal action by a group of women over their treatment, discrimination, assignments, appointments, and another by a different group, as I recollect, a minority group as well for the same reasons. So we were trying to make sure that we complied with those the court decisions. And we eventually, during my time, reached compliance on those. But that meant that from the day I walked into the office, I was aware of the issue and really spent some considerable time on that. But you asked the first part of the question, which was how important, how did I see it? It's critically important. And I liked a bit what Ambassador Sharpless just said. One immediately thinks of, look, we want the face of America when we're abroad to look like America. We want people from all backgrounds to be out there, to be seen by our counterparts, by our friends and allies, and the people who are not our allies, that everyone in the United States has a chance to be a representative of America. But the reference that Ambassador Sharpless made, I think, to the domestic front is extremely important. It's important that we have a diversified group right here at home in the Department of State building itself, and out in the outreach to America, that it be not all white males for sure. And so it's critical. Now, just before I became Director General, I was actually posted to the United Nations as Madeleine Albright's deputy at the UN. I remember getting a phone call from Dr. Hudson from Georgetown, who said, I understand from the grapevine you're going to be nominated as Director General. Well, Skip, I want to tell you right now, the first thing you better do when you get there is to resurrect the program that we had that brings minorities into the Department of State. And I said, well, why don't you explain it to me? He said, well, we had a program, but the Justice Department said it was illegal. It was discriminatory against other groups, and we could not have a program deliberately aimed at one group. And so I told him on the phone, you got that right. That's going to be one of my first efforts. So when I got to the department, was in the job, I raised it immediately, and my legal advisor in the L Bureau immediately said, Skip, I'm sorry, you can't do that. Doesn't matter how much you want to do it. The Justice Department has already said it's impossible. And I said, well, I think I can design something that will pass. And they said, well, you can try. And what I came up with was that we ought to have a program that could bring in disadvantaged Americans. And it didn't say African Americans, Hispanic Americans, it said disadvantaged Americans. And they looked at it and they said, well, we're willing to let you try, and we'll see what Justice says. In the meantime, they actually checked out with Justice, who said, it sounds okay to us. And that became a program that I initiated and kept during the years I was Director General. It's now called the Pickering Fellowship Program, named after a very distinguished diplomat, Tom Pickering. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we got it started. But, you know, the problem for me is that this was a fledgling effort. It still was only a very limited number of people coming in each year because it was an annual program. So it was only going to have a very minor impact over a long period of time. Important one, but not a big one. But the other thing, and I don't want to talk too long, but the other thing that I was determined to do as Director General, there's a committee called the D Committee after the Deputy Secretary that meets during the course of the year to select the career officer that we want to propose through the Secretary to the President, to the White House, to be ambassadors, our ambassadors. I made certain that there was women, that there were women and minorities on every single list, short list, that I sent forward to this committee. The Director General, I always would come up with anywhere from 5 to 10 names, depending on the post and whatever, and make sure that there were candidates representative. And there was an interesting development conversation in the D Committee when we would take a look at the segments of, say, the African countries. Well, let me use different Middle East countries, which I know so well. We would go through them one by one and pick the candidate we thought best for that country. But at the end of the review, I always posed the obvious question, well, not obvious because it hadn't been done before, was, look, we just picked for the 6th post, 5 white males and 1 woman. Is that where we want to be? Are you serious? And we would go back and look at the list that we had, where oftentimes we were between 2 candidates to make sure that we had, in fact, candidates from different groups to go forward. But this takes an initiative. This doesn't happen naturally. And I'll stop there. But thank you for this opportunity to mention that.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. Next up is Ambassador Ruth Davis.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the museum for hosting us and thank Jim Dandridge and Michael Crin for pulling this panel together. And I'll start, Dr. Crin, by answering your first question. Why is diversity and inclusiveness so important? Well, first of all, the Foreign Service Act of 1980 indicates that the Foreign Service should be reflective of the American population. It should be, but it is not. For example, the African Americans account for 12.3% of the population, and only 6% of Foreign Service African American generalists are in the Foreign Service. And another group, Hispanics. Hispanics account for at least almost 13% of the population, and they only account for about 6% of the generalists in the Foreign Service. My second point would be that in this day and age, America needs a strong and high-performing foreign policy and foreign service to develop and execute foreign policy that is required to advance our interests and defend our security and to regain our international leadership status in the world. Diversity is important in this endeavor because diversity brings in new ideas, experiences, and perspectives which lead to better problem solving and policy development. I myself firmly believe that in the absence of a diverse, inclusive foreign service, America is missing the vital contributions that a significant portion of our population would bring to the table if only we would let them in and if only we would welcome them. Now, my second part of your question is, what did I do to foster diversity and inclusion as Director General? I endeavored to put emphasis on recruitment, retention, and promotion. On recruitment, I worked with Congressman Rangel and his staff to institute the Rangel program, which has since brought into the service 292 underrepresented Foreign Service officers, with another 125 in the pipeline. I also worked on creating a pipeline through increasing the number of paid internships so that more minorities could afford to undertake internships with a view to attracting them to the Foreign Service. Unfortunately, due to budget constraints, the number of internships have diminished. However, Congressman Castro and a number of others up on the Hill are promoting a bill that says that the State Department must pay its interns. When I was Director General, I paid special attention to BEX, which is in charge of assessment and examination. And I made a special effort to ensure that there were experienced minority examiners brought on board, sometimes from the outside. And on retention, I promoted participation of underrepresented officers in the International Career Advancement Program, ICAP, which helps to prepare mid-level foreign service officers and others in international affairs to advance to senior levels. And I'm happy to say that a substantial number of ICAP participants, such as Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, who will be our Chief Diversity Officer, many of those people who participated in that program are receiving high-level appointments in this new administration. And more importantly, I undertook to mentor numerous young upcoming officers, many of whom became ambassadors, and one of whom I'm particularly proud, Linda Thomas Greenfield, ambassador to the United States with cabinet level status. And on promotions, I focused on ensuring that the promotion and selection panels were diverse and emphasized that the selection of public members should be very well overseen. So that's basically what I did and basically how I see the importance of diversity.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth. And that will now bring us to Ambassador Thomas. You are still on mute.
Mute.
Thank you. Thanks to the Diplomacy Center Foundation. And I ask that all of us take a moment after this program to remember Ambassador Larry Palmer, the late ambassador to Barbados and Honduras, who passed away far too soon yesterday. I echo what my colleague said. America has a large toolbox, and you want to use everyone in that toolbox to make effectiveness. American corporations that are diverse make the most money. People that take advantage of everyone's talent. And that's what we need in the State Department, in our embassies. There's been a retreat from that at a time when we're trying to tell other countries to have human rights, gay rights, honesty, free and fair elections. If we look like and act like hypocrites, we will fail as a nation. Our ability to lead and partner will be compromised. The second question, what did I do? Well, a few things. At the urging of Ambassadors Davis and Ambassador Brazil, when the Wrangle program was facing funding challenges, I went to Secretary of State Rice and asked her for $1 million. And she immediately granted without blinking, without blinking. She said, we need these people. Second, my distinguished deputy, Ambassador Teddy Taylor, and I wanted to expand paid internships, and we wanted to recruit people from all over America. So we went to small colleges like University of Nebraska, Wesleyan, Hamilton College in Ohio, but Wiley College, Langston College, Johnson C. Smith, Delaware State. The HBCUs, sometimes it did not have a lot of African-American representation. We went to Hispanic college and we recruited people for paid internships. We were able to pay them $500 a week. We had to work with their alums to get them transport to Washington. And some specialists came out of these programs. We found that some of the schools had criminology programs where we could get paid internships. Lastly, discussed extensively with Secretary of State Rice the fact that the prevalence of African-American chiefs of mission in Africa and the Caribbean. And by the time she left, we had selected or named 4 to be chiefs of mission in East Asia and Pacific, something that had never happened before or since. I want to make sure people understand that. So leadership at the top, the involvement, and not just rhetoric, made a difference. And I commend the people that I was able to work with for helping us achieve those goals.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Thomas. Last but not least, we'll turn things over to Ambassador Chacon.
Thank you, Diplomacy Foundation, for inviting me to this distinguished panel. I, of course, associate myself with all of the comments of those who have spoken today. And I must say, it's a very humbling experience. I stand on the shoulders of a lot of great directors general. And quite simply, what we tried to do was continue to build on the blueprint of many of the programs that have been introduced by many of my fellow panelists, try to grow them, try to, again, to keep that flame lit. I would say that a diverse, inclusive foreign service isn't just a nice thing to do. It's absolutely essential. We want to have an effective foreign policy. Simple. And to have an effective foreign policy, we have to have a foreign service that reflects the greatness of our country, the power of our example. And so to me, you know, I don't think that people should be wringing their hands about, is this a good thing to do? Is this not a good thing to do? Back and forth. It's quite simply, we're going to be the United States of America and realize our full potential. We can't be doing this battle with one hand behind our backs. Regarding initiatives, in particular on my watch, I try to focus on the need to have a more agile and flexible State Department. And that means, you know, reforms. We took a diagnostic and looked very closely at the performance management system, tried to make that more dynamic, to update it to be sure, and it's due for another overhaul soon. We looked at the bidding and the assignments process. Again, you know, this shouldn't be rocket science to be able to change that. To be sure, the Foreign Service Act has been 40 years since it was passed, and we need to update so many really important things in that. So I would say, you know, certainly paid internships, we tried to grow that program, but we know what we have to do. We need to get the support of the Hill, of Americans who need to understand why we matter to the bottom line, to get to work and to do and implement all of these great ideas. We do not need to reinvent the wheel here. And I think that's the great thing about all of us here on this panel. We're all on the same page, but we just need to do a better job of strategic communication so that we get the allies. And we've gotten so many more allies on the Hill than we used to have. But Americans are beginning to understand, this is not a nice thing to have an effective foreign service, but absolutely essential for our future. Thanks.
Well, thank you to everyone for getting the conversation going. I'm going to take a bundle of questions here that we received before the program and that we're also receiving during the presentation night and ask a fairly broad question. First, why, after all of this time and all of these efforts and all of these programs and the efforts on your behalf, are we still facing these problems with the Department of State, Foreign Service, our foreign policy bureaucracy? What are the obstacles that are keeping these institutions from achieving that diversity and inclusivity? And what are the steps that need to be taken? If you could talk to our new Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, what needs to be done to change this situation?
Well, I think that one of the issues is that when potential candidates take a look at the State Department, they don't find it as attractive, especially underrepresented candidates. They don't find it as attractive because they don't see mirror images of themselves at the top. They want to, especially the smart ones, want to go into professions or institutions that they feel that they can advance and reach the senior and top levels. And that is not always clear in the State Department. We are blessed, and I say blessed and I mean it, with an administration that is now paying a lot of attention to diversity issues. The Secretary of State, as it has been noted, has named a Chief Diversity Officer, and I believe that that diversity officer reports directly to him, which really means something. And I believe that there's a lot on that officer's shoulders, but a lot that she, as it happens to be a she, Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, can do to help to make the institution a more attractive institution. For instance, I have developed in my head a list of all of the things that I'd like to see her do. I know she can't change the whole structure, but she certainly should sit on what we call the D committee, which selects ambassadors. She needs to play an active role on that and make sure that underrepresented Americans are selected as ambassadors. And she also needs to be an active part of the Deputy Chief of Mission Selection Committee, ensuring that underrepresented FSOs are assigned to DCM, Deputy Chief of Mission, and Principal Officer position. And she should develop standards that hold the Bureau accountable for inclusion of underrepresented FSOs who should be assigned worldwide and they should be assigned to leadership positions, desk officer positions, deputy assistant secretary positions, positions at top levels. And the CDO, as I call it, Chief Diversity Officer, should ensure that appropriate, helpful statistical data on assignments in all of the bureaus are kept current, and that she and the secretary can look at those statistics and see which bureaus are really practicing diversity and inclusion. And if they're not, the assistant secretary should be held accountable. The only way that we can assure diversity and inclusion in these organizations is to make sure that there is a commitment to the top. And if there is not a commitment to the top, then there should be some answers given.
Yes, Ambassador Sharpless.
I personally think that the Foreign Service and all foreign affairs agencies should do a better job of making the Foreign Service career path known. The average American in college and the average college or throughout this country does not know about the Foreign Service. They know about foreign affairs because they hear it on the news. But I think if the foreign affairs agencies themselves were to get together and make a concentrated effort to educate young college students or even starting at high school about a career path in the Foreign Service and throwing the net to pull in all of the minorities, put it like that. And then those students will have a chance to learn, make a path as they're making their decision, as they're being trained to learn to know about the Foreign Service. I have met so many people in the Foreign Service who did not know about the Foreign Service until they were on their Peace Corps assignment. And that was my interest of going overseas initially in the Peace Corps, but my mother said the peace will be here to help me with these children. And I never got to the Peace Corps, so I went with the FAS. But I think if we really work to reach out to the young people as they're coming along, that would be a great, great effort to bring some minorities into the Foreign Service. Now, we all know what it takes to stay in there, and we all know what it takes when you have to leave your family and be moving around every 3 or 4 years. There's a certain type of person that's going to be the prime example of getting into staying in the Foreign Service. But I think if we made a greater effort in Washington, D.C. within all of the foreign affairs agencies, that would do a great job of helping to expand the diversity of the Foreign Service as we know it. Thank you.
Yes, Ambassador Gnehm.
Yes, I wanted to take off Mattie's, Ambassador Sharpless's suggestion because it brought to mind one of the answers to your question about obstacles. And certainly when I was Director General, I think one of the obstacles were we had trouble finding people interested in the Foreign Service. And so we said, well, why? And the reason was that people were in the categories we're talking about just were not aware. And it reminds me that, you know how I learned about the Foreign Service? It was from an 8th grade civics teacher who asked me one afternoon, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, well, I'm not sure yet. She said, how about the Foreign Service? I said, what is that? She says, oh, it's ambassadors and you live abroad, you get to travel. And I thought, man, that sounds like a great occupation. You know what? I never wanted to be anything else. But what we need is for teachers, for outreach to those people who influence young people, to make them familiar with the Foreign Service as a potential career and what it is. So that when and these could be guidance counselors in high school. I think it needs to start early. It's not just a college experience, it's an earlier one, so that people are aware of it and they get excited about what it might be. And then they pursue it. They start asking questions. I think that one of the efforts the department has made, it was in existence when I was Director General, which is the diplomat in residence. But I have to confess, it was a token effort. There were very few. We tried to put them in areas where they could recruit and in the minority area for inclusive purposes. But it was, they might have 3 states with how many educational institutions. That's crazy. But now we have more, and I think it's more targeted. And I think this is a good way of getting the word. And this is, unfortunately, it's mostly at the college level, but that's okay. That students, and I'm at GW, which is a school that has a foreign, as an Elliott School of International Affairs. So people go there thinking of it. But as was said earlier, there's a vast ignorance, even from those who know about the Foreign Service, about what it really is and what that career means and how you move up and what you need to know, the skills and whatever. These are things that need to be somehow communicated more effectively, because we want enthusiasts looking toward the profession. And so I'm glad we have far more diplomats and residences around the country. And again, I do think we need to try to see if there's a way to go down one level to the high school level.
We've gotten a number of questions from folks that have suggested that although recruitment is certainly one of the big issues, trying to get people to actually apply, to go into the State Department of Foreign Service, that's certainly a large issue. But many of these recent reports have noted that perhaps an even more striking problem is the inequality in terms of appointments and promotions once these individuals from underrepresented groups are actually in the State Department, Foreign Service, or other foreign policy bureaucracies. How do we deal with that? Yeah, Ambassador Chacon.
That's an excellent question, and it is very problematic. To be sure, we need to keep doing the mentoring that we're doing, and reaching out proactively to help people understand this culture, which is very difficult to understand, to give them access to good positions that make them promotable, that make them able to compete. Let's not forget, we are in a hyper-competitive culture. And excelling is everything here. But again, there is a way to understand how to do that and to set yourself up for success. The promotion process is determined each year by a workforce planning analysis. And the number of promotions is independent of the promotion board process itself, which is based on peer evaluation. Because the Foreign Service Act requires that the department ensure a regular, predictable flow of talent up through the ranks into the senior foreign service. And so each year, we as directors general had to look at a sophisticated computer model to project promotion opportunities at each skill and grade of the foreign service. And that model compares the number of established positions at each grade and in each skill category with the number of employees in each of those categories to determine surpluses and deficits. So there are a lot of factors that go into this, and I'm perhaps getting too much in the weeds, but it's time in class, time in service, mandatory retirement, and other factors such as hiring plans. Are we going to be bringing people into the Foreign Service? Career progression, attrition projections. So it's very complicated to predict what we need. And in fact, we have had, feast and famine in terms of hiring that wreaks havoc on the ability of many minorities of the lower ranks to be promoted up. And so therefore, there are so many things in our effort to do the right thing that complicate matters, but we're a lot like the military, and they're going to have this predicted flow up through the ranks. So the best thing is to make people competitive, to demystify what is going on, to give them the mentorship and the sponsorship they need so they don't make mistakes in their careers that keep them from getting promoted. I was promoted steadily but surely. I love the fact that, you know, I sat in grade many years for a long, long time, but I had a long career as a result. So again, there are many ways of looking at this, but again, the best thing is to have a mentor and a sponsor that helps you, you know, put together a career path, gives you some honest counseling so that in fact you can be competitive. And I think with that, you know, we will continue to have the very best of the best foreign services in the world because we do demand excellence.
I'm going to bring up a very controversial subject, but I saw it was in a couple of the questions, Ambassador Chacon's comment, and that's corridor reputation. This is an insidious situation within the Foreign Service. Everybody in the Foreign Service has a corridor reputation, and it's based on what people hear. It's not necessarily based on what's written in efficiency reports, contrary to what rules and regulations say. So when you try to assign people, inevitably, you know, people get on the phone and call each and others who served with them. Hey, do you know Skip Gnehm? Is he somebody I want at my post? And it already sets in motion certain stereotyping and certain these are obstacles you mentioned, Michael, earlier. It's a real problem in the Foreign Service. And I used to say when I was Director General and speaking to A100 courses, I understand what the law says, that your promotions and all are to be based only on what is in your personnel file. That's your efficiency reports. But that's false, because it's your corridor reputation that's going to have more impact on the jobs you get, and as a result of jobs that you get, your promotion opportunities. So what does that mean? That means you need to be excellent. That means you need to know what it takes to survive. And that is a very important job for mentors. And that program needs to be really, really engaging so that you tell people what you need to do to get a good reputation. I hate to put it that way, but I'm talking about real facts of life. You've got to be efficient. You've got to be a person who gets along well with people, maybe a good writer, because people will say, boy, does he know how to write things, or he makes great relationships with people, he's a good contact person, whatever it is, those kinds of qualities you want to demonstrate. And then you will get a good reputation, which will lead people to want you to work for them. And that results in good jobs. And let's face it, it is very, very clear, and this came out in some of the studies, that people who get assigned to certain kinds of posts, and they are, because again, I've been a Middle East person, where there is chaos, troubles, crises, the efficiency report that gets written about that officer who's been under gunfire and who's been level-headed and did this and that is going to stand out at the promotion board when they read it against a file, and forgive me, for another post, I guess I won't pick one, in another country where not much dramatic happened, but he did a great job and whatever. He's going to look good, but when you've got them and you've got to rank order, it really is clear that getting good assignments is important for that promotion opportunity forward. So I realize some of those remarks may not be popular with people who are hearing it today, but I think they're facts.
I would like to add that we will be back here 10 or 20 years if we don't change. Secretary Blinken is off to a very good start with his assistant secretary and undersecretary selections. They're more diverse than we have ever seen. But the fact is, the meat and potatoes of the Foreign Service is promotions as well as assignments. And unless the secretary and his team ensure that we end the systematic racism and cronyism that has denied minorities and many women opportunities to get in East Asia and Pacific or Near East affairs or European affairs, this will continue. That is a fact. There's no reason why we've had the last 4 years the lowest promotion rates of African Americans. We're told that we don't want to serve in Europe. People go on the Hill and lie about these things. So unless there is oversight, reports, and possibly rewards for people who do the right thing, there will be little or no progress. There will be tokenism. And like Ambassador Gnehm, I'm sorry, I don't care what people think about this. It has gone on too long and it will continue to repeat itself. And this is because the people who run the Foreign Service, not the political appointees, are interested in maintaining this last plantation status.
Well, given the issues and the obstacles and the fact that, you know, as Ambassador Thomas said, it strikes me that when I wrote my book 20 years ago about African Americans and the Department of State, I hoped that there would be this dramatic change. That hasn't happened. We now have the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. There are so many issues to deal with, so many problems to deal with, such complexities. What would you say would be the first most important step that she could take to address this problem? Not to solve the problem overnight, but the first important, meaningful step to actually address this problem and start making forward momentum. Yeah, Ruth.
Well, I think that the first step would be following on what Ambassador Thomas said. The first step would be to look at the assignment system and to make sure that underrepresented FSOs are represented all over the world at all levels, and especially at the senior levels. This, I think, is one of the most important steps that she can take, because what it will do is it will incentivize those coming on first to enter the service and second to stay there, because they see that their possibilities are wide range. Sorry about my phone. So that I think is the first thing that should be done. Focus on assignments. The next thing is that she should work on accountability, holding our senior level people accountable for what goes on in their bureaus. If you keep excellent statistics, it's easy to take a look and see if women are assigned to only consulates as consul generals, as opposed to assigned as the political chief in Paris or in one of our larger embassies. You can see if minority officers are assigned in their bureau in responsible positions. So this whole question of accountability is one that she should really focus on.
Ambassador Sharpless.
The wrong thing, clicking on the wrong thing. Thank you. Again, I'm back on my chopping block, but I personally think that the chief diversity and inclusion officer, who is working for the Foreign Service and not just the Foreign Service and State Department, should sit down with each in a group with the foreign agencies and listen to all of them at the same time of what the concerns are in the Foreign Service across the board, and then work on what has to be done in state, but let it be known to all of the other director generals that we have to be making changes in the Foreign Service, and let each director general go back to his or her agency and shape up what is going to be shipped out of State Department, because there's no need of going on one leg, you know, in the service. We all out there in that field under the same umbrella when it comes to carrying out the U.S. government foreign policy. That's what I think she should do and probably will do. Just become educated of what's happening in the Foreign Service worldwide. Thank you.
Yes, Ambassador Gnehm.
On your question about this new position, I want to say I am extremely excited that the secretary created this position, and I'm even more excited for his selection for the person to take this. She's terrific. She will be very good. She knows the system. She knows as much about that all of us put together anyway. But to go on, I think that some suggestions made earlier should be underscored at this point. She should be a participant in the D committee, where the committee makes those recommendations for career people to go forward as ambassadors. If she isn't, she should have a deputy who also participates in what I used to have, at least, were committee meetings that I chaired in the Director General's office to make selections for Deputy Chief of Missions lists that went out to ambassadors, where her office could monitor what names and make sure that there is diversification and inclusion in those. So I would think being active in those two decision-making when it comes to assignments would be a critical, important, give that office a real influence. But I just want to make one other observation, and that is, I think the success of any of these efforts is really due to leadership and to the commitment of the secretary and of the seniors in the rank of the department. The word cronyism has come up in a number of questions and whatever. I would bet some money that every single DG on this screen has had a call from another office up on the 7th floor, meaning the senior levels, either the deputy secretary or undersecretary, saying that so-and-so who's been on their staff ought to be getting a really good assignment at such and such and such and such and whatever, right? That has to stop. And I was very fortunate. Again, this is a personality and leadership issue. I was very fortunate that my Secretary of State was Madeleine Albright, who had decided early on, and she said this to me when I took the job, you are my personnel officer. I don't want to get involved in all of these things. You are going to be it, and I'm going to back you. And so when one assistant secretary went to her chief of staff to complain that an officer that this assistant secretary wanted to be out as an ambassador in a country and had not even gotten a good nod, chief of staff said, you don't want to go see the secretary, which is what he wanted, because she's not good. She's going to overrule you. He did, and he came out very long-faced and slammed the door and left because she told him what the chief of staff said. I'm sorry, Skip is my personnel officer and he knows what's best, and you need to talk to him if you have a problem. But that's a very, I'm not sure how often that is in terms of relationship between a secretary and the person who's in the DG's office. Well, I can even go on. We've had undersecretaries because of the chain of command. The DG is in the family of M, the management undersecretary. And sometimes we have very strong individuals in that who do intervene in the assignment process. And this has got to stop. This is a serious problem, and it will only happen if at the secretary and the deputy secretary level, they make it clear that they're not going to be those interventions that are permitted. I'll stop there.
Skip, let me follow up on something that you said. You said the chief diversity officer should make sure that the DCM lists are diverse. Well, I got to tell you that you got to go further than just making sure that the lists are diverse. Because what happens is when ambassadors out in the field, political ambassadors as well as career ambassadors, they pick very frequently somebody who looks like them, somebody who they feel comfortable with because they look like them. We got to develop some sort of mechanism where the chief diversity officer can work with these ambassadors and make sure that underrepresented FSOs are selected as DCMs all over the world. And the importance of this is that being DCM is really a good training ground for becoming an ambassador.
Ruth, I'm very glad that you added that because it was something I should have said as well, but you're dead right. And I appreciate that add to what I was saying earlier. You're dead right.
I would like to add that I'm very pleased that my longtime friend, Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley, was selected for this job. She will do a great job, but she's not alone, and she shouldn't be allowed to be alone. And we can't let the assistants and undersecretaries say, well, that's Gina's job. It has to be a coordination.
Right.
And she has to be allowed to work with the assistant secretaries, the undersecretaries, the ambassadors in the field to ensure that the reason she were hired for works, and not just lumped with all of the challenges that she's surely to face, not just left alone. There are people who already have knives out for her, people who don't want her to have this job. We know this. And unless she is given support inside and outside the department, her efforts will fail.
And that echoes one of the comments we just got from the audience. In the past, to the department's credit, there were many initiatives to advance diversity, and that is certainly the case. However, it lacked seventh floor support, and the initiatives faded away after an assignment cycle. And I think a lot of it had to do with what Ambassador Thomas just talked about, that very often these programs and initiatives are made the responsibility of one or two or three people, and they are supposed to handle the problem. And I think Ambassador Thomas just made an excellent point that this has to be more than one person lifting this burden on their back and trying to solve the problem on their own. Well, we've also gotten a few questions here about two particular issues that folks have identified. That being the Foreign Service exam and the promotion boards. And I think we're talking about there in terms of diversity, getting a more diverse crowd, but then inclusivity, having people promoted. What can be done about these two very traditional parts of the Foreign Service? Is it time to revise these, the exam, the promotion boards? Is that something that the Chief Diversity Officer should be looking at very, very carefully? Or maybe I'll find another question.
No, I was thinking that Arnold might answer that because he talked earlier about promotion boards and how they're organized. I was going to defer to him. Arnie, sorry, I put you on the spot.
No, again, I think we have to be cognizant that there are two different issues. One are the promotion boards, and one are the way that you come up with the statistics, the numbers for promotion. So that's what I was talking about the last time around, is that so many of these other factors in terms of resources and the like, in terms of the numbers that we can hire, directly affect the numbers of people that we can promote. The promotion boards themselves, of course, it's a peer review process, but everything is determined by, as you say, what is on the page there, and that is determined by the assignments that you get. I will say that I've sat on several promotion boards. Those efficiency reports that stand out are those that focus on leadership. And I think that is the real Achilles heel of our system. We have so many smart people, but we don't have really the effective leaders that we need. And perhaps I'm coming from the point of view where I am now at the National Defense University, and I see how seriously the military takes professional development. And we don't take it as something important. It's kind of a nice thing to do if you have the time to do it, but we're just notorious of throwing people in and letting them swim, and those that magically don't drown, we think, oh, they're special. But as Director General, I was shocked at colleagues of mine that became ambassadors that were ineffective leaders. I don't know what happened to them. They certainly didn't get to be an ambassador by making these mistakes beforehand. But there was a lack of accountability. There was a lack of taking care of the troops. There was a lack of real strategic leadership. And leaders aren't born; they're made. And I think that's through professional development. And we don't put the resources that are necessary to train people at each stage of their careers to become effective leaders. Regarding the exam, again, we've toyed with things on the margins in terms of, the qualifications evaluation panel, trying to take into account experience and seasoning and things like that to be able to bring in a wide variety of people, or recognize those talents in the exam process, so that in fact, we can increase the pool. That is clearly unsatisfactory. We need to compete for talent. There are many, many gifted minorities that I think have been discussed here today who don't give us a second thought, because they just don't see this as an avenue that they want to pursue. So we're losing to Amazon and Google and Wall Street, frankly. And again, if we don't compete for talent, tell the story, and to explain why we love this career, because it's one of purpose and meaning, and why you would want to do this, I don't think you're going to get the best of the best, because they see what we are, and they see that perhaps it's better for them to be successful, and at 38 come in as an assistant secretary and ambassador, have made the political friends and contacts that they need to be successful. So it's very complicated. Obviously, I think we need to look at the exam. It's the hardest thing about ourselves is that changing our culture, and we're the ones responsible for that. They can come from the outside, but if we're not behind that, if people really aren't supporting a different way of bringing in people, we're never really going to fundamentally change, I think, the equation.
Let me follow up on your points about leadership. I remember coming into the Foreign Service and hearing things throughout my career, like, boy, he or she can write a great political report, but they can't manage their way out of a paper bag. And that means that people are not happy. People don't feel part of the institution. They don't really feel that they've got good management. And that does not bode well for people staying in the Foreign Service. When I was the director of the Foreign Service Institute, I had the opportunity and the great pleasure of instituting a school of leadership and management, hoping that there would be a continuum of leadership training from the time that people enter the Foreign Service to the time that they become senior officers. The problem is that we need to have more personnel resources so that we can set aside training, set aside slots for training so that everybody doesn't have to rush out to post yesterday. One of the things that the Department of State really needs to do is to develop what we call a training float, and a training float that can't be touched except for assigning people to training. When I was DG, we had the Diplomatic Readiness Initiative, and we got 1,800 positions. And we thought we were really prepared to give people the opportunity to do training. What happened? The Middle East absorbed all of those, Iraq absorbed all of those positions. So we need to have the Congress set aside a certain number of training positions that cannot be touched except for training, so that we can develop the leadership that we really need to take the State Department into the future.
Well, I think we've had an interesting conversation and probably an uncomfortable conversation for many people who are listening about a tough subject and about a lingering and long-standing problem with the Department of State and Foreign Service. And we've certainly gotten some great responses from our audience, and I appreciate that. I think we have come to the point where we are out of the time for our particular part of the program. And so I would personally like to thank Jim Dandridge and the folks at the Diplomacy Center for setting this up. I'd certainly like to thank our participants. This was a distinguished panel. These are people who have been on the front lines of this battle and who have been saying things tonight that, once again, perhaps people did not want to hear. But those are the things that actually need to be said, because those are the things that need to be done. And so I appreciate everyone's honesty and forthrightness in dealing with such a tough subject. So thank you, everyone. At this time, it is going to be my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Jane Carpenter Rock, who is the acting director of the National Museum of American Diplomacy. And she has some very exciting news about the museum's latest online exhibit called Facing Diplomacy. So Jane, the screen is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Krenn. And thank you so very much to this distinguished panel for a riveting conversation. We didn't want it to end. We could sit here all night, really benefiting from your experiences and your wisdom. We thank you so much for giving us some of your time and your thoughts. You've given us incredible food for thought. I'd like to thank the Diplomacy Center Foundation for asking me just to say a very few words this evening. And I would also very much like to thank the Diplomacy Center Foundation for their continued partnership in helping to build the National Museum of American Diplomacy. Like Dr. Krenn said, my name is Jane Carpenter-Rock. I'm the acting director of the National Museum of American Diplomacy. And I just wanted to share with you a project that we are working on with Dr. Krenn and with the Diplomacy Center Foundation to highlight the stories of diverse American diplomats. As we know from the conversation tonight, it is an extremely important topic. And I will be very quick because that was a very tough group to follow. The goal of the National Museum of American Diplomacy is to tell the story of the history, practice, and challenges of American diplomacy. We are doing this to explain the value of diplomacy to the American people. As Ambassador Sharpless and Ambassador Gnehm both said during their remarks, most Americans really don't know what diplomacy is and don't understand what diplomats do. So we are trying to do something about that at our museum. And the primary way we plan to do that is through the voices and stories of America's diplomats. These are voices and stories that for too long have not been sufficiently heard or honored by the American people. Many of these voices have been diplomats of color who have made significant diplomatic contributions while also working to ensure the mechanisms of diplomacy and foreign policy properly reflect and embrace the diversity of the United States. In an effort to tell these stories, the National Museum of American Diplomacy has developed an educational resource on our website called Facing Diplomacy, and you see a graphic display of it here. We have developed this in coordination with Dr. Krenn and Jim Dandridge from the Diplomacy Center Foundation, and we'd like to thank them so much for their collaboration. This resource gives vignettes of diverse diplomats and curates academic resources where visitors can find more information about these diplomats. As you will see here, we started the project focusing on African-American diplomats, but stay tuned because this resource will grow and evolve in the coming weeks and months to profile Asian American diplomats, Hispanic American diplomats, and others. So on this slide here, you will see that if you go onto the website, and if you go onto this page, there will be a button where it says download scholarly resources on African-American diplomats. And if you click that button, if you go to the next slide, it will show you a very robust, fulsome record of all sorts of primary and secondary research resources on a host of diverse diplomats. You will see, here's a quick screenshot of what the resource page looks like. The one on African-American diplomats is over 50 pages long and very comprehensive with so many amazing, historic, iconic African-American diplomats. And if you'll see here, Ambassador Ruth Davis is in there. I'm also proud to say we have Ambassador Sharpless profile, Ambassador Harry Thomas as well. And we hope to profile Ambassador Chacon in the coming weeks and months. So this will continue to grow and evolve. We ask you to stay tuned. We can't wait for you to see all the amazing research that has been done on these amazing diverse diplomats. So you can go to the last slide. So that's all I have to say. I thank you all so much. I thank the Diplomacy Center Foundation for their partnership with us. And we ask you to continue to follow our progress. And thank you again to the wonderful panelists. At this time, I'll turn it back over to Michael Crin and Jim Dandridge.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carpenter. On behalf of the Diplomacy Center Foundation, I congratulate you for this illustrious presentation in the National Museum of American Diplomacy, which again demonstrates its breadth beyond the confines of just the brick and mortar walls here at State Department, 21st Street Northwest. It truly will join the ranks of the finest museums that digitally reach out to the heart of America and beyond. Our gratitude to this most valuable panel of experts, former Directors General of the U.S. Foreign Service, who have once again responded to the service call to make the American foreign policy machine the best that can be found anywhere globally. Dr. Michael Crin, who has once again demonstrated his excellence in helping us to be all we can be to the maximum of our potential. And finally, to our Diplomacy Center Program Staff Officer Kelly Scandon. Thanks for making this evening an informative evening. To you, our audience, without your presence and substantive participation, none of this would have been possible. Thank you again. Visit the museum. I promise you, when it opens, it's going to knock your socks off. Have a good evening. Good night.